Hey, so this is post-recording me. In the middle of making this video, I found out that Trump has pushed the Mexico and Canada tariffs back to April, so forgive me for aging this video by mentioning March at the start. It's not really that important for the rest of the content. Also, forgive me for even mentioning April now, because if I had to bet, he'll push it back again. Anyway, on to the actual video. With the Trump administration set to put up blanket 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, this time for real, at the start of March, now is an excellent time to talk about why tariffs are always bad and never good. There is really no nuance to this. The closest I'll get to saying that tariffs can be excusable is that they can make sense in a trade war in the same way that burning material and manpower to fight a war can make sense. The next closest sense is that it's possible to imagine a country with a government so weak and or poor that having tariffs is better than nothing. I'll get to that later. First, let's talk about the two main arguments in favor of tariffs. One being tariffs as a source of revenue, the other tariffs as a way of protecting domestic industries. You can protect and raise the frequency of my videos' appearance in the YouTube algorithm by liking, commenting, subscribing, and hitting the notification icon. Thanks. Continuing to the topic of tariffs, they are a terrible way to do protection and raise revenue. Starting with protection, presumably the idea is that you're trying to give domestic industry an edge. So local buyers are forced to source what they want domestically, creating demand for it and stimulating that local industry. This, of course, means higher prices. The whole reason why they would have otherwise imported those goods is because they would have been cheaper to do so. It's also worth noting that protection only makes domestic goods more competitive in domestic markets. Your country imposing tariffs domestically does not make those products any cheaper to the outside world. The steelman argument for protection tariffs is the infant industries argument. High tariffs now to incentivize development of that sector so they can eventually compete globally, allowing you to lower those tariffs. However, putting aside whether or not the government can pick and choose winners successfully like this, I happen to think it often can, but that's besides the point for this video. A much more effective way to support infant industries is to subsidize them directly or indirectly, like, for example, giving the companies in that industry money or making their input goods cheaper by paying to educate the workers they want to hire, or by providing better transportation, energy, and communication infrastructure, and so on. And also, by the way, if you're successfully subsidizing them, those subsidized goods are cheaper not just for domestic consumers, but also international consumers, allowing you to create those global trade ties for an eventually healthy industry that doesn't need any special support. Now you may ask, how would you pay for all that? And the quick answer is taxes. Before there's any whining, remember that the entire premise of tariffs for protection is that you're deliberately making things more expensive for domestic consumers so that local production can compete. So people are going to end up having to pay more, whether it's through taxes or higher revenues for local producers. The difference with taxes is that you can target who pay them in a way that you can't with the cost increases of a protection tariff, which is an excellent segue to the problem with tariffs as a source of revenue and foreshadowing about why countries end up setting tariffs anyway. Now, no matter how much Trump and his cronies want to talk about setting up an external revenue service, the costs of tariffs overwhelmingly fall on the importer. It functions essentially as a sales tax on foreign bought goods, and people generally don't talk about sales taxes as being paid for by the seller. There is a situation where the cost of tariffs is partially paid for by the seller, however. If they don't have alternative buyers willing to pay for that product at its current rates, they might be forced to decrease prices somewhat to make the product still attractive to the tariff purchaser. The highly internationalized nature of trade in this era makes this scenario's application limited, especially when the exporter might also just have the option of increasing its own domestic consumption of that good. So, since the tariff is a sales tax, it is, by nature, regressive. Lower-income people spend a greater share of their income on purchases than higher-income people do, meaning that tariffs hit lower-income people harder. All of this is putting aside the other complications that come with tariffs, like the fact that choosing to implement them can trigger trade wars that harm both your exports and imports, or the fact that highly globalized supply chains of today mean that good countries thrive at producing can suddenly become uncompetitive due to the need to pay more for inputs that would have otherwise been imported, which can also harm national exports. Or the arbitrary nature of tariffs being applied at borders means that supply chains where goods cross multiple times across one border, as is the case with the automobile industry between Canada and the US, face a tariff on those products each time they cross. So if tariffs are so terrible, why do countries use them at all? Let's start with the least cynical reason. Tariffs are a type of tax that any government capable of controlling their borders has at least some capacity to enforce. It is a tax that a government with low legitimacy and/or bureaucratic capacity can relatively easily implement. This is part of why, if you look at the countries with average tariff rates above 10%, you'll notice they're exclusively developing countries. This contributes to why tariffs were so important to the United States' industrialization story in the 19th century. Those tariffs provided revenue that was turned into investment into internal improvements, infrastructure that drove economic growth. It also led to people deferring spending that would have gone to consuming international goods, like luxuries, and instead spend that money on purchases and investments domestically if they chose to spend it at all. However, much the same can be accomplished by applying other types of taxes. But again, why not? Why not build up the bureaucratic capacity to deploy more effective means of revenue generation? It comes back to what I said earlier. Different taxes can be targeted, and as it turns out, wealthy people who can better afford being taxed also tend to have great political power and prefer not to have the tax burden targeted at them if they can avoid it. The result, in developing countries with weak governments, then, is that tariffs become the path of least resistance in building the capacity for internal investment, lest the government of the day face backlash from the rich and powerful and overthrow or otherwise pressure them. This also means that developing countries of the modern day are put in a terrible vice grip. Organizations like the IMF will come around and tell them, not incorrectly, that tariffs are bad for economies, so they demand they keep them low in exchange for financial aid. But they also demand that these governments refrain from ever becoming strong enough to go after the rich property elite within their countries to find alternative means of financing internal improvements. Add in covert intelligence operations, overthrow governments that attempt to go in that direction, and you're left with countries whose only path to development is the hyper-exploitation of their poor and risking getting into foreign debt traps, if they're lucky enough to see any development at all. As for those of us in the developed world, we find ourselves in our own way facing similar circumstances. Understood this way, the turn towards tariffs combined with the deliberate aim to rip apart the bureaucratic capacity of the federal government of the United States appears as part of a coherent project by billionaire oligarchs like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel. Tariffs are not only economically inefficient, they are part of a deliberate class war against the working classes of developed countries, and at best, a class collaborative, politically expedient means of accomplishing development in developing countries. In summary, tariffs are arbitrary consumption taxes levied at borders that are never defensible as a means of raising revenue or protecting industries. The strongest excuse for levying tariffs outside of a trade war is just having too weak or unwilling of a government to employ taxation that targets wealthier individuals to raise general revenue and or support developing industries. Tariffs exist as an additional means of imposing the cost of the state and economic growth on lower income people. And as always, the private accumulation of wealth into the hands of a narrow elite is inherently impoverishing to society.